The phone call that ended my marriage did not start with an argument or a tearful confession. It started with a frantic whisper from a bank manager. She said my husband was sitting in her office right now, applying for a $2.5 million loan. That was suspicious enough. But then she lowered her voice and said the woman sitting next to him was holding my identification and claiming to be me. I told her that was absolutely impossible because my husband was on a flight to Chicago for a wealth management seminar. She told me to come to the bank immediately through the employee entrance and to trust no one. My name is Natalie. I am 33 years old and work as a senior commercial real estate risk analyst. Up until that Tuesday afternoon, I thought I had a flawless marriage. If you have ever had your entire reality shattered by the person sleeping next to you, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a manipulator who thought you were a fool. Now let me tell you exactly how I began dismantling his life. It was a rainy afternoon in Seattle. I was standing on the third floor of an abandoned industrial complex holding a clipboard full of blueprints. My job involves assessing massive commercial properties for corporate acquisitions. I spot structural failures, zoning risks, and financial liabilities before millions of dollars change hands. I am trained to see the hidden cracks in concrete and contracts. Ironically, I never saw the massive crack running right through the foundation of my 6-year marriage to David. David was a wealth management advisor at a prestigious family office. He wore tailored suits, possessed a charming smile, and handled all of our joint finances. He was the kind of man who bought me coffee every morning and kissed my forehead before leaving for work. Just that morning at 6 o'clock, he had packed his leather overnight bag. He kissed me at the front door, complaining about the miserable weather he would have to endure in Chicago. I had wished him a safe flight and told him to call me when he landed safely. I was inspecting a load-bearing wall when my cell phone vibrated in my pocket. The caller ID showed Brenda. Brenda was a veteran branch manager at the downtown bank where I held my personal and business accounts. We had known each other for years, sharing a mutual respect built on navigating the male-dominated finance sector. I answered the phone expecting a routine question about an upcoming wire transfer. Instead, I heard Brenda speaking in a hushed, rapid tone. "Natalie, are you in the city?" Brenda asked. Her voice sounded incredibly strained. I told her I was just south of downtown on a site visit. Brenda took a sharp breath and told me she was currently hiding in the secure file room adjacent to her main office. She said David was sitting at her desk right now. He was initiating a collateralized loan for $2.5 million. He was using the prime commercial block in the Arts District as collateral. That property was a direct inheritance from my late grandfather. It was solely in my name, and David had zero legal rights to leverage it. I laughed in confusion and told Brenda that David was in Chicago. I told her he must be doing some preliminary paperwork for a future investment we had not discussed yet. Brenda cut me off immediately. She said David was not alone. She told me the woman sitting next to him was handing over my driver license, my social security card, and my original property deed. Brenda said the woman shared my exact hair color, my posture, and was even wearing a designer winter coat identical to the one I bought last month. The woman was actively impersonating me to authorize the loan. The clipboard slipped from my fingers and slammed onto the concrete floor. The loud echo bounced off the empty industrial walls, but I barely heard it. A cold wave of adrenaline washed over my entire body, paralyzing me for a fraction of a second. My brain instantly shifted into risk analyst mode, processing the variables at lightning speed. To pull off a $2.5 million commercial mortgage fraud, David needed my original documents. Those documents were locked in a fireproof safe in our home office. A safe that only he and I had the combination to. This was not a spur-of-the-moment mistake. This was a highly calculated and premeditated financial heist orchestrated by the man I loved. He had stolen my identity, hired an imposter, and timed it perfectly for a day when I was supposed to be completely unreachable on a remote site visit. If Brenda had not been the manager on duty today, the loan would be approved. David would drain the equity of my family legacy and vanish without a trace. Brenda told me to stay completely silent on the phone. She instructed me to drive to the bank immediately, but warned me not to use the main lobby doors. If David saw me walking through the front entrance, he could easily claim it was a misunderstanding, cancel the transaction, and quietly wire our liquid savings offshore before I could freeze the accounts. I needed to catch him in the act without triggering his escape plan. Brenda told me to pull into the secured delivery alley behind the bank and use the staff access door. I left my hard hat on a pile of bricks and ran to my car. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The drive into downtown Seattle felt like navigating through a nightmare. Every red light felt like an hour. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I refused to shed a single tear. Crying would not save my assets. Strategy would. I pulled into the narrow brick alleyway behind the bank building and parked next to a dumpster. I took a deep breath, pushed open the heavy metal security door, and stepped into the quiet back corridors of the bank, ready to witness my husband commit a federal crime. The fluorescent lights of the employee corridor hummed with a low mechanical vibration. I moved past the break room and the security lockers with my rubber-soled boots, making absolutely no sound against the polished linoleum. My mind was a terrifying mix of hyper-awareness and complete disbelief. Brenda was waiting for me at the end of the hall right outside the main administrative hub. She looked pale. She grabbed my arm with a firm grip and pulled me into an empty adjacent conference room. The room shared a glass wall with her primary office where the loan closing was currently taking place. Brenda had closed the vertical blinds before stepping out, but left a tiny sliver open for me. I stepped up to the glass. I held my breath and peered through the narrow gap. There he was, David, the man who had kissed me goodbye at 6 in the morning. He was sitting in a plush leather guest chair looking completely relaxed. He was wearing his navy bespoke suit, the one I had picked up from the dry cleaners 2 days ago. But it was not his presence that made the blood freeze in my veins. It was the woman sitting next to him. My hands started to shake. The woman was a carbon copy of me. She had my exact auburn hair perfectly styled in the same loose waves I always wore. Her posture mirrored my professional straight-backed stance. But the detail that made my stomach churn was her coat. She was wearing a camel-colored cashmere trench coat. It was the exact same limited edition coat I had purchased last month from a boutique downtown. David had complimented me on it. He had told me it made me look powerful. Now I realized he was just taking mental notes to dress his decoy. David reached over and gently held her hand. He gave her that same reassuring smile he always gave me when we navigated stressful situations. The intimacy of that gesture felt like a physical blow to my chest. He was holding her hand while she presented forged documents to steal my grandfather's legacy. This woman was not just a random actress. She had been coached. She knew how to sit, how to lean into David, how to present the paperwork with the calm authority of a senior commercial real estate analyst. My vision tunneled. A surge of primal rage hit me so hard I actually placed my hand on the glass door handle. I wanted to throw the door open. I wanted to scream until my lungs gave out. I wanted to flip the heavy mahogany desk, tear that cashmere coat off the imposter, and demand to know how long this psychopathic performance had been going on. I wanted to see the color drain from David's face when he realized he was caught. But my hand froze on the cold metal handle. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe. In my line of work, a single emotional decision can cost a client $100 million. I evaluate risks. I calculate downside exposure. Right now, bursting into that room was the highest risk action I could possibly take. David is a senior wealth management advisor. His entire career is built on moving massive amounts of liquid capital across international borders in fractions of a second. For 6 years, he had full control over our joint checking accounts, our savings portfolios, and our mutual fund investments. I had trusted him implicitly because finance was his domain. I focused on real estate while he grew our liquid assets. If I walked into that room right now, the element of surprise would last exactly 10 seconds. David would realize the fraud was exposed. He would play the victim, claim the woman tricked him, or create some elaborate lie to cause a scene. And the moment he stepped out of that bank, he would pull out his encrypted smartphone. With his high-level clearance and executive banking apps, he could wire every single dollar we shared into untraceable offshore shell companies before I even made it to my car. I would save the commercial property, but I would lose everything else. He would leave me completely destitute while he vanished into thin air. I stepped back from the glass. The anger in my chest compressed into something entirely different. It turned into a sub-zero calculating fury. I was not going to give him the satisfaction of a screaming wife. I was not going to give him the opportunity to panic and cover his tracks. I needed a tactical strike. I needed to lock the gates of the fortress before the enemy knew they were under attack. Brenda stood beside me, watching my face. She whispered, asking what I wanted to do. I looked at her and asked exactly what stage of the loan process they were in. She told me the application was fully approved. The title search was cleared and the imposter had already passed the initial identity verification. David was just waiting for Brenda to return and authorize the final wire transfer of $2.5 million. I asked Brenda how fast the wire would hit his account. She said it would be instantaneous because David had set up a priority receiving account specifically for this transaction. The money would bounce through a domestic holding account and immediately sweep into a foreign trust. Once Brenda pressed the final key, the money would be gone forever. I looked back through the blinds. David checked his expensive watch. He looked impatient. He was so close to the finish line. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. He thought his meticulous planning was flawless. He had underestimated the woman he married. I turned to Brenda and told her we needed to freeze the transaction immediately without triggering his escape protocols. We could not reject the loan because that would cause an immediate red flag. We needed to trap the money in digital purgatory. I told Brenda to walk back into that office with a polite, apologetic smile. I needed her to tell David that a federal biometric security flag had temporarily stalled the banking system. We needed to buy exactly 48 hours. 48 hours for me to audit my entire life. 48 hours to find out who this woman was. 48 hours to prepare an ambush that would completely destroy David financially, legally, and personally. Brenda nodded, understanding the assignment perfectly. She smoothed her blazer, put on her best customer service smile, and prepared to re-enter the lion's den. I stood in the shadows waiting for the game to begin. Brenda pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped back into her office. I kept my eyes fixed on the narrow opening between the vertical blinds. From my hidden vantage point, I could see the exact moment Brenda shifted from my ally into the seasoned corporate banking executive. She offered David a warm, apologetic smile and sat down behind her desk, clasping her hands together. I watched David lean forward, anticipating the final confirmation of his $2.5 million theft. Instead, Brenda delivered the lie with absolute perfection. She told David that the funds had been fully approved, but an automatic federal biometric security flag had just been triggered on the account. She used complex financial jargon to make the roadblock sound completely impenetrable. She mentioned anti-money laundering protocols and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. She explained that due to the sheer size of the commercial equity line, the system required a mandatory 48-hour holding period in a secure escrow account before the final wire could be released to any external destination. I watched David carefully. I have spent years analyzing the micro-expressions of desperate property developers and deceitful corporate buyers. I know what a panic response looks like. David tightened his jaw. The knuckles of his right hand turned white as he gripped the armrest of the leather chair. But his face remained a mask of charming understanding. He offered Brenda a smooth smile and asked if there was any way to expedite the process, citing a fictional tight deadline for a new investment opportunity. Brenda stood her ground. She told him federal algorithms could not be manually overridden, and any attempt to force the transfer would automatically freeze the property deed for 6 months, pending an investigation. That threat worked instantly. David knew better than to argue with federal banking regulations. He nodded graciously and stood up, adjusting the lapels of his bespoke suit. He turned to the woman sitting next to him and placed a gentle hand on her lower back. He told the imposter that they would just have to celebrate their new venture on Thursday instead. The woman offered a practiced, polite smile to Brenda, gathered her purse, and stood up. I watched them walk out of the office together. My husband was guiding a thief through the lobby with the same protective affection he used to reserve for me. I stayed completely still in the dark conference room until I saw them exit through the main revolving doors. Brenda quickly moved to her computer monitor, switching to the exterior security cameras. We watched David and the imposter walk toward a sleek black sedan parked down the street. He opened the passenger door for her, closed it, and walked around to the driver's seat. The car pulled away, disappearing into the Seattle traffic. Brenda exhaled a shaky breath and unlocked the door to the conference room. I stepped out, my legs feeling heavy but my mind racing with terrifying clarity. Brenda locked her office door behind us and turned off her exterior availability sign. She told me I had exactly 48 hours before the system would demand a resolution for the escrow hold. I sat down in the chair the imposter had just vacated. The leather was still warm. I pulled my laptop out of my bag and connected it to Brenda's secure network terminal. I told Brenda that if David was brazen enough to forge commercial real estate documents, he was absolutely hiding other financial landmines. I needed to see the entire board. I bypassed the standard consumer credit checks and used my senior analyst credentials to access a comprehensive deep dive into my own financial footprint across Equifax, Experian, TransUnion, and LexisNexis. The screen populated with years of financial history. I scanned the lines of data looking for hidden credit cards, unauthorized personal loans, or secondary mortgages. My joint accounts with David were still untouched. He was clearly waiting for the massive $2.5 million influx before draining the smaller accounts. That made sense. He did not want to trigger any fraud alerts that might jeopardize the main heist. But then my eyes caught an anomaly in the recent inquiry section. 3 weeks ago, a major insurance underwriting firm had performed a hard pull on my credit and medical history. I frowned, leaning closer to the screen. I had not applied for any new insurance policies. My corporate benefits package covered my health and standard life insurance. There was absolutely no reason for a private underwriter to access my data. I traced the inquiry code and hacked through the public verification portal to find the source document. The digital paperwork loaded onto my screen. My blood turned into ice. My lungs completely stopped working. It was a term life insurance policy. The coverage amount was a staggering $5 million. I scrolled frantically through the policy parameters. The application had been submitted electronically using my stolen digital signature. David had bypassed the mandatory medical examination requirement by paying a massive premium upfront and submitting my clean health records from a physical I took just last month. The premium payments were being routed through an untraceable limited liability company. I checked the activation date. The policy had gone fully active exactly 48 hours ago. I looked at the beneficiary section. There was only one name listed: David. He was the sole recipient of the $5 million payout in the event of my unexpected death. Brenda looked over my shoulder and gasped, reading the figures on the screen. She put a hand over her mouth, stepping back in horror. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with sickening violence. The $2.5 million loan was never the final goal. It was just the severance package. David had told me he was flying to Chicago for a seminar. He had ensured I was going to be completely isolated today on a remote industrial site on the south side of the city. An abandoned complex with no security cameras and steep concrete drop-offs. If I had not received that phone call from Brenda, I would be standing alone in that dark warehouse right now. I did not just want to drain my grandfather's legacy and run away with his new woman. He wanted to double his payout. He wanted $5 million in clean, untaxed life insurance money. If I died today on that site visit, it would look like a tragic workplace accident, a structural collapse, or a fatal fall. David would have a perfect alibi because he was supposedly thousands of miles away in Chicago. He would return to Seattle as the grieving widower, collect the insurance money, pocket the real estate loan, and vanish to the Cayman Islands. The 48-hour escrow hold Brenda had just created did not just pause a bank transaction, it paused my execution. David needed me alive until the $2.5 million officially cleared the bank. If I died while the loan was still in federal escrow, the bank would immediately freeze the transaction, pending a probate investigation, and he would lose half his prize. I stared at the glowing screen, realizing the horrifying truth. The man I had shared a bed with for 6 years was actively hunting me. He was waiting for the bank to release the funds on Thursday, so he could finalize his plan. He thought he was in control of the timeline. He thought I was just a naive wife waiting for him to come home. I closed my laptop with a sharp snap. The shock evaporated, completely replaced by a ruthless will to survive. He wanted a war over assets and blood. I was going to give him one that would burn his entire existence to ash. David held my hand in the passenger seat of his luxury sedan. His thumb drew slow circles on my knuckles. Yesterday, that touch would have made me feel safe. Tonight, it felt like the cold slither of a snake. He was driving us to his parents' estate for our mandatory monthly family dinner. He was playing the role of the doting husband with terrifying perfection. He asked me if I was feeling all right because I had been quiet since he returned from his fake Chicago trip. I forced a warm smile and told him I was just tired from a long week of site inspections. I told him I was perfectly fine. I had to be. I was sitting next to a man who had already priced out the value of my life. We pulled up to the sprawling colonial mansion located in the most exclusive zip code of Mercer Island. Thomas and Diane, my wealthy in-laws, were waiting by the grand mahogany double doors. They were the kind of people who wore their money like armor. Thomas inherited a lucrative shipping logistics firm, and Diane spent her days curating charity galas to secure their social standing. For 6 years, I thought they were simply pretentious. Tonight, I was about to discover they were something much darker. We stepped into the grand foyer. Diane greeted me with a stiff, unconvincing hug. She kissed the air next to my cheek, ensuring her expensive makeup remained flawless. Then she turned to David, and her entire demeanor transformed. She cupped his face with genuine affection, calling him her brilliant boy. Thomas clapped David on the shoulder, pulling him toward the study to pour him a glass of top-shelf bourbon. I was left standing in the hallway holding a bottle of wine they would inevitably complain about later. We moved into the formal dining room. The table was set with heavy crystal and polished silver. Rachel arrived 10 minutes late. Rachel was David's younger sister. She strutted into the room dripping in designer labels paid for by her parents. Following quietly behind her was her husband, Terrence. Terrence was a brilliant African-American software developer who had built a promising tech startup from the ground up. He was sharp, hard-working, and carried himself with a quiet dignity. But in this house, none of that mattered. To Thomas and Diane, Terrence was merely a prop. He was a diversity token they paraded around their liberal friends, and a punching bag they abused behind closed doors. We all sat down at the sprawling table. David pulled my chair out for me, kissing the top of my head before taking his seat next to his father. The psychological warfare began before the appetizers were even served. Diane took a sip of her Chardonnay and fixed her cold gaze on me. She asked if I was still working at that tedious commercial real estate firm. I kept my voice perfectly level and told her I was currently a senior risk analyst, managing acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Diane offered a patronizing laugh. She waved her hand dismissively and said it sounded incredibly dry. She looked at her friends across the table and declared that crunching numbers all day must be exhausting for a woman. She said she could never imagine being buried under boring spreadsheets instead of building a real legacy. David jumped in right on cue. He placed a supportive hand over mine and told his mother that I worked very hard. He said my little job kept me busy and out of trouble. My blood boiled. My little job was the only reason we had access to the $2.5 million commercial property he was currently trying to steal. He was mocking me while actively setting up my execution. Then the conversation shifted. Thomas raised his crystal glass, commanding the attention of the entire room. He announced that he wanted to propose a toast to his son. Thomas puffed out his chest and declared that David was on the verge of a massive financial breakthrough. He said David was about to secure a game-changing expansion that would elevate their family legacy to unprecedented heights. Thomas looked at David with a proud, conspiratorial grin. He said the wait was almost over and the ultimate payoff was just days away. My heart slammed against my ribs. I picked up my water glass to hide the slight tremor in my fingers. I looked around the table. Diane was beaming with pride. Rachel was raising her glass in eager anticipation. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They knew. They might not know the gruesome details of the $5 million life insurance policy. They might not know about the hitman or the fake accident David had planned. But they absolutely knew he was funneling a massive amount of stolen capital into their family accounts. They were actively celebrating the theft of my grandfather's legacy. They were complicit in draining my wealth to fund their arrogant lifestyle. I was sitting at a table surrounded by predators who were eagerly waiting to feast on my corpse. The conversation abruptly pivoted to their favorite secondary target. Thomas turned his sharp gaze toward the end of the table. He asked Terence how his struggling little app was doing. Rachel rolled her eyes and audibly sighed, complaining that Terence worked too much for zero return. Diane added a sickeningly sweet tone, asking if Terence needed another loan to keep the lights on at his urban office. She emphasized the word urban, with a heavy loaded implication. The microaggressions were blatant and relentless. Thomas joked that maybe Terence should give up the startup dream and get a real job in logistics, where they could keep a closer eye on him. They were publicly castrating him financially and emotionally. Terence clenched his jaw. The muscle in his cheek ticked. He gripped his fork so tightly his knuckles turned white, but he did not utter a single word of defense. He knew any response would just feed their sadistic entertainment. I watched Terence carefully. I saw the quiet, burning rage in his eyes. I saw the isolation. He was trapped in a gilded cage surrounded by people who viewed him as an inferior asset to be exploited and mocked. He was another outcast, sitting at a table of thieves. For 6 years I had ignored the toxic dynamics of this family to keep the peace. I had played the polite daughter-in-law while they subtly disrespected me. I had watched them abuse Terence and stayed silent because it was not my battle. But tonight, everything was different. The blinders were permanently off. I saw the entire board clearly. David leaned over and whispered in my ear, asking if I was enjoying the dinner. He smiled, showing his perfectly white teeth. I looked back at him and smiled even wider. I told him I was having the most enlightening evening of my entire life. I shifted my gaze down the long mahogany table. Terence looked up from his untouched plate. For a fraction of a second our eyes locked. He saw the cold, calculating fury in my expression, and I saw the desperate, simmering hatred in his. We did not exchange a single word. We did not make a single gesture. But in that silent exchange across a table of monsters, a silent pact was forged. I knew exactly who my first ally was going to be. Dinner finally concluded with Diane insisting everyone retire to the drawing room for port wine and cigars. I politely excused myself, claiming the heavy food and vintage wine had given me a slight headache. I told David I was going to step outside for some fresh air on the terrace. He barely glanced away from his father, simply nodding and telling me not to catch a chill. He was too busy celebrating his imaginary victory to notice the lethal shift in my demeanor. I stepped through the heavy French doors onto the expansive slate patio. The cold Seattle night air bit into my skin, immediately clearing my head. The estate overlooked Lake Washington, and the dark water mirrored the pitch-black sky. Standing at the far edge of the stone balustrade was Terence. He was gripping the railing, looking out at the water with his back turned to the house. The tension radiating from his posture was palpable. I walked toward him, my heels clicking softly against the stone. He did not turn around until I was standing directly beside him. Up close, the exhaustion on his face was undeniable. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, completely isolated in a house full of people. We stood in silence for a long moment, listening to the wind rustling through the manicured hedges. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I looked straight ahead at the dark water and told Terence that I knew David was moving money. I told him I knew this entire family was built on a foundation of financial fraud. Terence froze. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his dark eyes narrowing with suspicion. In this family trust was a fatal liability. He asked me what exactly I thought I knew. I kept my voice barely above a whisper, but laced it with absolute certainty. I told him David was currently trying to steal $2.5 million, using my inherited commercial property as collateral. I told him David had purchased a $5 million life insurance policy on me just 48 hours ago. Terence stared at me in stunned silence. The defensive wall he had built around himself instantly shattered. He realized I was not playing a game. I was a casualty standing on the same execution block he was. He looked back at the glass doors to ensure no one was watching us from inside the mansion. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a thick linen cocktail napkin and slid it across the cold stone railing toward me. He told me to memorize the sequence of letters and numbers written inside and then destroy the napkin immediately. He said it was the master decryption key for David's hidden external hard drive. I looked at him in shock, asking how he knew about the encrypted drive I had found in the golf bag. Terrence let out a bitter, humorless laugh. He said he was the one who originally built the encryption protocol for David 2 years ago. Terrence had designed it as a favor to his brother-in-law, believing David needed secure client data storage. Instead, David had used it to hide a massive criminal enterprise. Terrence leaned closer, his voice trembling with a mixture of grief and pure hatred. He finally revealed the truth he had been forced to swallow for the past 8 months. Terrence had developed a revolutionary artificial intelligence financial compliance software. He had trusted Thomas and David to act as his primary financial advisors, to handle the seed capital and early funding rounds from outside investors. They were supposed to secure the money in stable domestic accounts. Instead, Thomas and David took millions of dollars from the startup funding and siphoned it into highly volatile, unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchanges. They were chasing massive illegal yields, trying to multiply the money behind Terrence's back. But the crypto market crashed overnight. The offshore exchange was liquidated by federal regulators. Millions of dollars belonging to Terrence's investors vanished into thin air. I felt sick to my stomach. I asked Terrence why he did not go straight to the authorities. His eyes darkened with a profound sorrow. He explained that Thomas and David had meticulously forged internal authorization documents. They routed the IP addresses to make it look like Terrence had personally initiated the offshore transfers. They framed him flawlessly. When Terrence discovered the theft and confronted them, Thomas and David dropped the hammer. They blackmailed him. They told Terrence that if he went to the police, they would hand the forged documents over to the federal authorities. They reminded him that the justice system rarely gives the benefit of the doubt to an African-American man facing white-collar crime charges against a wealthy, prominent white family. They threatened to ensure he went to federal prison for decades. Worse, they promised that Rachel would immediately file for divorce and take full custody of their 2 young children, leaving Terrence to rot in a cell while they raised his kids. They had trapped him in a perfect nightmare. They used him as a scapegoat to cover their massive financial failure and forced him to sit at their dinner table taking their racist microaggressions and disrespect with a smile, just so he could stay in his children's lives. A cold, silent fury washed over me. I took the napkin and slid it into my pocket. The sheer arrogance of David and Thomas was staggering. They believed their wealth and status made them untouchable. They believed they could discard a brilliant software entrepreneur and a senior risk analyst without any consequences. I looked at Terrence and told him the rules of engagement had just changed. I told him David was waiting for a federal escrow hold to clear on Thursday morning so he could funnel my stolen $2.5 million out of the country. I proposed a counterstrike. Terrence had the cyber skills to trace, hack, and intercept David's digital routing codes. I had the legal expertise, commercial real estate knowledge, and banking alliances to build an ironclad financial trap. If we combined our resources, we did not just have to survive this. We could utterly destroy them. We could reroute the stolen funds, clear Terrence's name, secure my life, and leave David and his parents facing the very federal prison sentences they had threatened Terrence with. Terrence looked at me. The exhaustion in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, lethal clarity. He nodded slowly, extending his hand. I shook it. 2 outcasts, despised and exploited by the same family, had officially formed an alliance in the dark. We turned and walked back toward the glowing French doors of the mansion, slipping our masks of polite compliance right back into place. We were ready for war. We turned and walked back toward the glowing French doors of the mansion, slipping our masks of polite compliance right back into place. We were ready for war. Terrence and I wasted absolutely no time. The moment we left the suffocating atmosphere of the estate, we initiated our counteroffensive. We met at a discreet 24-hour diner on the industrial outskirts of the city. The rain lashed against the greasy windows, hiding us from the rest of the world. Terrence brought his secure, heavily encrypted laptop and opened it on the sticky Formica table. I handed him the master decryption key I had memorized from the cocktail napkin just an hour earlier. Within minutes, Terrence breached David's hidden external drive. His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up lines of code and hidden directories with terrifying speed. He navigated through the offshore holding accounts and shell company registrations that David had used to launder money. He found a recent wire transfer paying for an extended stay at the Grand Azure, a luxury hotel right in the heart of downtown Seattle. The room was booked under a corporate alias that David frequently used for dummy investments. But Terrence dug deeper. He accessed the hotel registry system through a backdoor exploit and extracted the guest profile attached to the keycard. The woman impersonating me was not just a high-end escort or a random actress hired for a day job. Her real name was Sylvia Vargas. Sylvia was a professional predator. Terrence pulled up her digital footprint on the dark web and cross-referenced it with public federal databases. The results were staggering. She had an extensive rap sheet spanning 3 different states. She was a wanted identity thief specializing in commercial wire fraud and high-net-worth account takeovers. She had drained corporate accounts in Nevada, forged property deeds in Arizona, and vanished before federal agents could raid her safe houses. There were 2 active federal warrants out for her arrest. David had not hired an amateur to steal my grandfather's legacy. He had hired a ruthless mercenary. But David had made a critical miscalculation. He thought he was controlling the entire board because he held the purse strings. He did not realize that mercenaries have zero loyalty to their employers. They only care about self-preservation. I told Terrence to print everything he could find on her. I wanted every mugshot, every federal warrant, every known alias, and every piece of digital evidence connecting Sylvia directly to David. I compiled the documents into a thick, heavy manila folder. I was not going to negotiate with this woman. I was going to back her into a corner she could not escape. At 6 o'clock the next morning, I parked my car in the dimly lit underground parking garage of the Grand Azure Hotel. The air was freezing and smelled strongly of damp concrete and exhaust fumes. Flickering fluorescent lights cast long, distorted shadows across the empty parking bays. Terrence had tapped into the hotel security network and was tracking Sylvia's keycard activity in real time. He sent a text message to my burner phone confirming she had just stepped into the elevator and was heading down to the garage level. I stepped out of my car and waited in the pitch-black shadows behind a massive concrete pillar. The elevator doors chimed loudly and slid open. Sylvia stepped out into the damp garage. Seeing her again up close sent a fresh wave of visceral disgust through my veins. She was wearing my exact hairstyle tailored to perfection. She was carrying a designer handbag that looked identical to the one sitting on my passenger seat. She walked confidently toward a sleek silver rental car parked near the VIP section. She was likely heading out to meet David for an early breakfast to finalize their story before the bank opened its doors. I stepped out from behind the pillar and physically blocked her path. Sylvia froze completely. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as she recognized my face. For a split second, she experienced the uncanny horror of seeing her own target standing alive and breathing right in front of her. She tried to maintain her composure, attempting to step around me without saying a single word. I slammed the thick manila folder onto the hood of her rental car. The loud smack echoed sharply through the empty concrete garage, making her flinch. I looked her dead in the eyes and called her by her real name. I told her I knew exactly who she was and exactly what she was doing. I told her David was setting her up to take the fall for a $2.5 million federal bank fraud. I explained that David had taken out a $5 million life insurance policy on me and planned to orchestrate my death by the end of the week. I asked Sylvia if she really thought a man willing to brutally murder his own wife would let a hired identity thief walk away with a massive cut of his stolen money. I told her she was a liability, and David was going to eliminate her the moment the money cleared the offshore accounts. The color drained entirely from Sylvia's face. The arrogant swagger of a professional con artist vanished, instantly replaced by the primal fear of a trapped animal. She looked down at the dossier resting on the hood of the car. I opened it and showed her the active FBI warrant staring back at her. I delivered a blood-chilling ultimatum. I told her she had exactly 2 choices. Choice 1 involved me. pressing a single button on my phone and sending her current location, room number, and fake aliases directly to the local FBI field office. She would be in federal custody facing decades in prison before noon. Choice 2 involved her walking into that bank today and deliberately sabotaging David's loan application. I pulled a thick envelope from my coat pocket and dropped it next to the dossier. I told her I would give her $20,000 in untraceable cash right now to intentionally botch the signature verification process in front of the bank manager. I told her she needed to hold the pen wrong, hesitate, and make the signature look unconvincing. Once she ruined his plan, she could take the cash, get in her rental car, and disappear forever. Sylvia stared at me, her breathing shallow and rapid. She calculated the odds in her head. She knew David was a sinking ship, and she knew I had the power to end her freedom right then and there. She reached out, grabbed the manila folder, and shoved it into her designer bag, along with the envelope of cash. She looked at me and nodded sharply, agreeing to the terms without uttering a single word. She got into her car and drove away, leaving me standing alone in the cold garage. The trap was officially locked and loaded. I drove back to our upscale suburban house as the sun began to rise over the Seattle skyline. The trap was officially locked and loaded, but the execution required absolute precision. The house was quiet when I slipped through the garage door. David was still upstairs, sleeping the deep, untroubled sleep of a sociopath who believed his master plan was operating flawlessly. I walked into the kitchen and began preparing a lavish breakfast. I cracked eggs, whisked batter for pancakes, and fried thick cuts of applewood smoked bacon. The rich smell of fresh coffee and sizzling butter filled the entire ground floor. It was the perfect picture of domestic bliss. In reality, I was setting the stage for a psychological execution. I arranged the ceramic plates on the marble island, ensuring the silver cutlery was perfectly aligned. In my line of work setting, the environment is half the negotiation. You make the opponent comfortable before you pull the rug out from under them. At exactly 7 in the morning, David walked down the hardwood stairs. He was wearing his tailored charcoal suit and a crimson silk tie. He looked sharp, confident, and ready to steal $2.5 million. He paused at the edge of the kitchen, looking genuinely surprised by the extensive breakfast spread. He offered me that same charming smile he had given Sylvia the day before. He walked over, wrapped his arms around my waist, and kissed my cheek. He asked what the special occasion was. I kept my voice incredibly light and cheerful. I told him I just wanted to do something special for my hardworking husband before he headed into the office. I watched him take a seat at the island, unfolding his linen napkin. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, completely oblivious to the fact that his carefully constructed world was about to catch fire. I sat across from him with a cup of herbal tea. I watched him eat. He talked about his day, fabricating a schedule full of client meetings and portfolio reviews. He complained about the traffic he would have to face on his commute. Every word out of his mouth was a calculated lie. I nodded and smiled, playing the role of the supportive, naive wife. Then I shifted my posture. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool marble. I told him I had a major realization while he was away on his fictional Chicago trip. I kept my tone soft and reflective. I brought up my grandfather. I talked about how hard he had worked to acquire that commercial block in the Arts District. I mentioned how the property had always been a symbol of family legacy and community value. David chewed his food slowly, nodding in agreement. He offered a platitude about honoring family roots. He had no idea I was steering him directly into a concrete wall. I took a slow sip of my tea. Then I dropped the bomb. I told David that I had spent the entire afternoon yesterday sitting in the office of a high-level wealth preservation attorney. I kept my eyes locked on his face as I delivered the next sentence. I casually mentioned that I had made the definitive decision to transfer the entire commercial real estate block into an irrevocable charitable trust. I explained that the paperwork was already drafted, signed, and sitting on the attorney desk. The legal filing would be submitted to the county and federal registries at exactly noon today. I made sure to use precise legal terminology so he understood the absolute finality of the action. I told him that once the clock struck 12, the irrevocable trust would permanently lock the asset. The property could never be sold, mortgaged, or leveraged for any kind of financial gain. It would belong to the trust, forever protecting it from any future liabilities or claims. It was the ultimate asset protection strategy. I smiled warmly and told him I knew he would be so proud of me for making such a philanthropic and secure financial decision. The physical reaction was immediate and deeply satisfying to watch. David stopped chewing. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a bespoke suit. He reached for his coffee mug, but his hand was shaking so violently that dark liquid sloshed over the rim and spilled onto the pristine white marble counter. He quickly put the mug down his chest, rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. His mind was short-circuiting. I could almost see the gears grinding inside his head as panic flooded his nervous system. I knew exactly what this meant. The bank had placed a 48-hour escrow hold on his fraudulent $2.5 million loan. That hold was scheduled to clear later this afternoon. But if my fictional irrevocable trust activated at noon, the commercial property would instantly become legally untouchable. The bank underwriting system would automatically flag the title change. The collateral would vanish. The loan would be immediately canceled, and his massive payout would evaporate into thin air. His timeline had just been violently compressed. He was trapped in a rapidly shrinking window between the bank opening its doors and the imaginary noon deadline. David tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat and forced a stiff, unnatural smile. He stammered that it was a huge decision to make without consulting me first. He suggested we wait a few weeks to review the tax implications together. I waved off his concern with a breezy laugh. I told him the attorney had assured me the tax benefits were flawless, and the filing could not be delayed under any circumstances. David stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He abandoned his half-eaten breakfast. He grabbed his briefcase with frantic, uncoordinated movements. He told me he just received an emergency alert on his phone about a massive market fluctuation regarding a major client portfolio. He claimed he had to get to the family office immediately to manage the crisis. His voice was pitched high-tight with pure terror. He did not even kiss me goodbye. He practically ran toward the front door. The heavy oak door slammed shut. Seconds later, I heard the aggressive roar of his car engine and the loud screech of tires tearing out of the driveway. I sat alone in the quiet kitchen, bathed in the soft morning light. I picked up a cloth and slowly wiped up the coffee he had spilled on the marble counter. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out my smartphone. I hit the stop button on the voice recorder app. I had captured every second of his panicked stammering, his frantic excuses, and his desperate, chaotic exit. I saved the audio file to a secure cloud server, syncing it directly with Terrence. The psychological warfare was highly effective. David was now operating on pure adrenaline and sheer panic. A panicking man makes reckless mistakes. And today I was going to let him make the biggest mistake of his entire life. I grabbed my coat and left the quiet kitchen behind. I had no time to waste. I drove straight to a secure private office space on the west side of the city. Terrence had rented the windowless room under a fake corporate entity to ensure our operations remained completely untraceable. When I walked through the heavy glass door, he was already sitting in front of 3 glowing high-definition monitors. His fingers moved across the mechanical keyboard with the speed and precision of a seasoned hacker. I pulled up a chair next to him and placed my phone on the desk, connecting it to his secure network. The air in the room hummed with the sound of cooling fans and pure, unadulterated focus. I asked Terrence for a status update. He tapped a few keys and brought up a digital map on the left monitor. A blinking red dot showed David speeding down Interstate 5, breaking every speed limit rule in Washington state. His desperation was palpable even through a digital tracking signal. Terrence had breached David's smartphone by exploiting an active banking application session. David was frantically refreshing his offshore holding accounts, making sure the Cayman Islands gateway was open and ready to receive the stolen funds. I was operating on pure panic, completely unaware that his entire digital footprint was currently being mirrored on the screens right in front of us. Terrence leaned back in his chair and explained the architecture of the trap we were about to spring. 2 years ago, when Terrence built the proprietary financial compliance software for his startup, he designed a highly specific routing protocol for international wire transfers. Thomas and David had exploited that exact protocol to steal his investor funds. They used his software to launder the money into unregulated offshore cryptocurrency markets. But those arrogant men made a fatal assumption. They assumed they understood the code better than the brilliant African-American engineer who wrote it. Terrence never gave them the master administrative keys. He had built a silent backdoor into the routing architecture for emergency security audits. Now he was using that very backdoor to rewrite the destination coordinates of David's shell company. Terrence typed a final string of encrypted commands and brought up a secure government payment portal. The official seal of the Internal Revenue Service appeared on the center monitor. I watched in absolute awe as Terrence explained the brilliant brutality of his plan. When Thomas and David lost millions in the crypto crash, they created a massive capital gains tax liability. The federal government demanded their cut. To avoid federal prison, Thomas and David forged tax filings pinning the entire massive penalty onto Terrence and his tech startup. They submitted fraudulent documents to the IRS, claiming Terrence was the sole beneficiary of the offshore trades. For the past 8 months, Terrence had been drowning under a devastating federal tax lien. The IRS was preparing to seize his business, his home, and his bank accounts. I was facing total financial ruin because of their racist, malicious framing. But today, the narrative changes permanently. Terrence opened the back-end infrastructure of David Priority Receiving Account. This was the specific domestic holding account David set up to catch the $2.5 million from Brenda before sweeping it offshore. Terrence did not touch the bank side of the transaction. He simply changed where the money would bounce once it hit David's personal control. Terrence linked the automated sweeping mechanism directly to the United States Treasury Payment Gateway. He applied a specific electronic payment voucher using David's personal Social Security number and Thomas' primary corporate tax identification number. I smiled as the genius of the trap fully materialized in my mind. When Brenda authorizes the commercial real estate loan, the money will legally enter David's possession for exactly 1 microsecond. Then the automated sweep protocol will trigger immediately. Instead of flying to a sunny beach in the Caribbean, the $2.5 million will instantly strike the IRS payment portal. It will automatically pay off the massive federal tax penalty, clearing the debt from Terrence startup completely. The beauty of this digital strike was the double-edged sword it created. By paying the tax debt from a domestic account linked directly to David, he would effectively be admitting legal ownership of the illegal crypto trades. He would be providing the IRS with a concrete paper trail proving he was the one who generated the tax liability in the first place. The federal government does not ask questions when a multi-million-dollar penalty is paid in full. They simply take the money and clear the ledger. Terrence would be free from the lien, and David would be left standing in the bank with zero cash and a glaring trail of federal fraud. Terrence hit the enter key, locking the new routing coordinates deep inside the banking software. A green confirmation bar flashed across the screen indicating the digital tripwire was invisible and completely unavoidable. We turned our attention back to the GPS tracker on the left monitor. The blinking red dot slowed down as it approached the downtown financial district. David was pulling into the parking garage beneath Brenda Branch. I was walking straight into a financial slaughterhouse of his own making. I looked at Terrence. The exhaustion that had weighed down his features at the family dinner was completely gone. It was replaced by the fierce determination of a man taking his life back. We sat in silence watching the GPS signal stop moving. David had parked his car. He was likely smoothing his tie and checking his reflection in the rearview mirror, preparing to play the role of the confident wealth manager one last time. He had no idea that every step he took toward the bank lobby was a step closer to his own destruction. The trap was set, and the jaws were ready to snap shut. Terrence switched the central monitor from the flashing GPS tracker to the high-definition closed-circuit security feed inside the bank lobby. Brenda had secretly granted him temporary administrative access to her branch cameras. We had a crystal-clear view of the heavy glass doors. Right on cue, David pushed through the entrance. He walked with long, aggressive strides, completely dropping the relaxed wealth manager persona he usually projected. He was sweating. He continually checked his expensive silver watch. Every second ticking closer to noon was a hammer striking his nerves. Sylvia was already sitting in the lobby waiting area. She looked terrified, but masked it well under the camel-colored cashmere coat. David approached her, grabbing her elbow with unnecessary force. He leaned in and whispered something into her ear. Through the high-resolution camera, I could see the rigid tension in Sylvia's shoulders. She clutched her designer handbag tightly, knowing it contained the $20,000 in cash I had given her. She knew exactly what she had to do to stay out of federal prison. A bank employee guided them into Brenda's private office. The camera angle shifted to a top-down view of the mahogany desk. Brenda was sitting tall, her hands neatly folded over a stack of closing documents. David and Sylvia took their seats. Even without audio, the physical dynamics in the room spoke volumes. David immediately leaned forward, pointing at the documents and demanding an update on the escrow release. Brenda maintained her flawless customer service posture. She typed a few keys on her terminal and nodded. She informed David that the mandatory 48-hour federal security hold had officially expired. The funds were queued and ready for the final authorization. I watched David physically deflate with relief. He slumped back against the leather chair, running a hand over his face. He thought he had beaten the clock. He thought he was minutes away from financial freedom and a flight to the Cayman Islands. He turned to Sylvia and offered her that same sickeningly sweet smile, signaling her to finish the performance. Brenda slid a digital tablet across the desk. She explained that since the federal hold had been triggered, the system required a fresh biometric signature from the primary collateral holder to execute the final wire transfer. She handed the stylus to Sylvia. I leaned closer to the monitor. My heart pounded rhythmically against my ribs. This was the defining moment. If Sylvia backed out of our deal and signed the document perfectly, David would get the money, and we would have to resort to a chaotic legal battle. But I had looked into Sylvia's eyes in that dark parking garage. I knew she valued her own freedom far more than she feared David. Sylvia took the stylus. She hovered her hand over the glowing digital screen. She deliberately positioned her wrist at an awkward, stiff angle. She dragged the stylus across the glass, intentionally altering the pressure points and the curvature of the letters. She botched the signature with the precision of a master forger who knew exactly how to trigger an automated rejection. Brenda looked at her computer monitor. A red warning banner flashed across her screen. She frowned and looked up at David. She apologetically informed him that the signature verification software had rejected the input. She stated that the biometric pressure and stroke velocity did not match the historical data on file for my identity. David shot out of his chair. He slammed both hands flat onto Brenda's desk, leaning over the documents. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson. He demanded that Brenda override the system immediately. He claimed the tablet was malfunctioning. He said his wife was simply nervous, and that holding up a multi-million-dollar transaction over a glitch was entirely unacceptable. He checked his watch again. It was 45 minutes past 11. I was 45 minutes away from my fictional irrevocable trust activating and wiping out his collateral forever. Brenda remained perfectly stoic. She calmly explained that federal compliance systems could not be manually bypassed by a branch manager. However, she offered a highly specific alternative. She pulled a fresh document from her drawer and placed it directly in front of David. She told him there was one legal loophole to force the immediate release of the funds today. As the spouse and secondary account holder, David could sign a personal guarantor addendum. I watched the screen as Brenda explained the terms. By signing the addendum, David would take absolute unconditional personal liability for the entire $2.5 million debt. If the collateral was ever challenged, invalidated, or locked into a trust, the bank would not pursue the property. They would pursue David directly. The debt would be irrevocably tied to his Social Security number, his future earnings, and his personal assets. David hesitated for a fraction of a second. A smart wealth manager would never sign a blank check for millions of dollars without reading the fine print. But David was not thinking like a wealth manager right now. He was thinking like a cornered rat. He was blinded by the ticking clock, the sheer greed of the pending payout, and the terrifying belief that my trust lawyers were currently filing documents at the county clerk office. He believed he was outsmarting the system. He believed he could sign the document, take the cash, sweep it to his offshore accounts, and vanish before the bank ever realized the collateral was compromised. He snatched the heavy metal pen from Brenda's desk. He did not read a single line of the legal text. He aggressively scribbled his signature at the bottom of the page, pressing down so hard he nearly tore the paper. He threw the pen down and demanded Brenda release the wire immediately. Terrence let out a sharp, breathless laugh beside me. He pointed at the secondary screen monitoring the back-end banking portal. A green notification box popped up indicating the personal guarantor addendum was officially logged into the Federal Registry. David had just legally claimed ownership of the debt. He had completely insulated me from any financial fallout. He had built his own gallows, tied the noose, and eagerly placed it around his own neck. Brenda typed the final command into her terminal. She smiled at David and confirmed the wire transfer had been initiated. David exhaled a loud, triumphant breath. He stood up, grabbed Sylvia by the arm, and practically dragged her out of the office. He was grinning. He felt like the absolute king of the world. He had no idea that the money he just borrowed was already flying through Terrence's digital backdoor directly toward the United States Treasury. I sat back in my chair watching David strut across the bank lobby on the monitor. The execution was flawless. David pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors of the bank and stepped out onto the bustling downtown Seattle sidewalk. The cold morning rain had briefly stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflecting the towering gray skyline. He took a deep breath of the crisp air. He adjusted his silk tie and unbuttoned his suit jacket. He was a man who believed he had just conquered the world. I thought he had successfully outsmarted his wife, the federal banking system, and the entire commercial real estate market. In his mind, he was already sitting on a white sand beach in the Cayman Islands, drinking expensive bourbon and laughing at my expense. He had no idea he was stepping directly into a financial grave. Sylvia walked a few paces behind him. Her camel-colored cashmere coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders, protecting her from the biting wind. She played the part of the compliant, adoring mistress until the very last second. But Sylvia was a ghost. She was a professional mercenary who knew exactly when a building was about to collapse. As soon as her expensive heels hit the public sidewalk, her posture changed. The submissive act evaporated instantly. She subtly shifted her weight, creating physical distance between herself and the ticking time bomb wearing a bespoke suit. She clutched her designer handbag containing the $20,000 in untraceable cash I had given her in the dark parking garage. She did not look at David. Her eyes scanned the busy intersection, looking for an immediate exit vector. David did not notice her shifting demeanor. His entire existence was currently focused on the rectangular device in his hand. He pulled his encrypted smartphone from his pocket. He bypassed the standard security lock and opened a highly secured offshore banking application. He cleared the dual authentication protocols with practiced speed. He was expecting to see a massive digital transfer pending in his primary Caribbean holding account. I was expecting to see $2.5 million sitting safely out of my reach, ready to fund his new life. The application dashboard loaded. The loading icon spun for 2 agonizing seconds. Then the numbers populated on the high-definition screen. The total available balance read 0. David stopped walking abruptly. He stared at the screen, his brow furrowing in deep irritation. He assumed it was a simple latency issue. International wires sometimes took a few minutes to bounce through domestic clearinghouses. He swiped his thumb down to refresh the screen. The loading circle spun again. The balance remained exactly at 0. Then a high-priority notification banner dropped down from the top of his screen. It was not a message from his offshore wealth manager. It was an automated intercept alert from the domestic holding account he had used to catch the funds. David tapped the notification with a trembling finger. A formal banking document rendered on his screen. The header bore the official seal of the United States Department of the Treasury. The text below the seal was cold, bureaucratic, and utterly devastating. The document confirmed that an incoming wire transfer of $2.5 million had been successfully intercepted and seized. The funds were instantly applied to an outstanding corporate tax penalty under the jurisdiction of the Internal Revenue Service. The seizure was executed using David's personal Social Security number, which he had proudly linked to his father's corporate accounts to maintain administrative control. The digital receipt proved the execution was absolute. The federal government had swept the entire loan amount before it ever reached the international gateway. They took every single cent to clear the massive cryptocurrency tax debt that Thomas and David had originally tried to pin on Terrence. By signing the personal guarantor addendum inside the bank just 10 minutes ago, David had legally verified his identity and his personal liability. He had practically gift-wrapped his stolen money and handed it directly to the federal authorities. David let out a strangled, gasping sound. His lungs completely forgot how to process oxygen. The blood rushed to his ears, creating a deafening roar. He frantically tapped the screen, trying to reverse the transaction. He tried to call his offshore banker, trying to find any button that would undo the nightmare unfolding in his hands. But you cannot negotiate with an automated federal tax seizure. The money was gone. It was permanently absorbed into the vast, infinite machinery of the government. Panic violently morphed into a blinding rage. David needed someone to blame. He needed a scapegoat. He spun around wildly, looking for the woman he brought with him. He was going to accuse her of botching the signature. He was going to grab her by the shoulders and demand she go back inside the bank to tell Brenda the transaction was a mistake. He opened his mouth to scream her fake name, but Sylvia was already gone. While David was staring at his dying financial empire, Sylvia had efficiently flagged down a passing yellow taxi at the edge of the intersection. She did not say goodbye. She did not hesitate. She slid into the back seat of the cab, blending seamlessly into the chaotic Seattle traffic. The taillights of the taxi disappeared down the crowded avenue, carrying the imposter and my cash payoff far away from the blast zone. She had executed her part of our blood pact perfectly and vanished into the ether, leaving David entirely alone. David stood frozen on the busy sidewalk. Pedestrians bumped his shoulders as they hurried past, completely ignoring the man having his life dismantled in real time. The rain started to fall again, hitting the screen of his phone. The freezing drops mixed with the cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He looked back at the heavy glass doors of the bank. He could not go back inside. If he marched in there demanding a refund, Brenda would alert security and potentially flag the fraudulent collateral. How was locked out? He ran the horrifying mathematics in his head. The commercial property was about to be locked into an irrevocable charitable trust, making the collateral worthless. He had personally guaranteed the $2.5 million loan to force the transaction. The loan money was seized by the IRS to pay a tax debt he could never publicly admit to owning without confessing to corporate embezzlement. Howe was holding a $2.5 million debt under his own Social Security number with an absolute zero balance in his checking account. He had no leverage. He had no escape fund. He was a dead man standing on the pavement. And he still had no idea that I was sitting just blocks away watching his entire life burn to the ground. David stumbled blindly toward the parking garage. His breathing was ragged as he pulled the cold, damp Seattle air into his burning lungs. He practically tore the keys from his coat pocket and threw himself into the driver's seat of his luxury sedan. He needed Thomas. His father always knew how to spin a financial disaster. His father had the untouchable contacts, the offshore emergency reserves, and the high-priced defense attorneys to stop this bleeding. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned stark white, and slammed his foot on the accelerator. He sped toward the Mercer Island estate, running red lights and swerving through heavy highway traffic like an absolute maniac. His mind desperately tried to formulate a cover story. He would tell his father that a rogue bank employee flagged the transaction. He would claim the federal government made a clerical error. He would invent any lie to buy himself another 24 hours to salvage his stolen fortune. He fishtailed into the sweeping circular driveway of the sprawling colonial mansion, scattering loose gravel across the pristine landscaping. He threw the car in park, leaving the engine running and the driver door wide open. He sprinted up the marble steps and burst through the heavy mahogany double doors. He screamed his father's name with a voice full of panic, expecting the sound to bring his parents rushing from the parlor. He expected to find Thomas in his study, ready to fix everything. I expected Diane to run toward him, asking what was wrong. Instead, a suffocating silence greeted him. He rushed down the main corridor and pushed open the massive French doors leading into the formal drawing room. The scene waiting for him stopped his heart entirely. I was sitting in the direct center of the plush leather sofa. I had changed out of my damp site inspection clothes and was wearing a razor-sharp tailored charcoal blazer. My posture was completely relaxed, my legs crossed, and a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea rested on my knee. Sitting to my immediate right was Terrence, looking calmer and more powerful than he ever had in this toxic house. Flanking us were three elite corporate litigators from the most aggressive financial defense firm in the Pacific Northwest. We were not unexpected guests. We were a firing squad. Thomas and Diane were already in the room, standing rigidly near the massive stone fireplace. Diane's face was chalk white, her expensive makeup doing absolutely nothing to hide the sheer terror in her eyes. Thomas looked like he had just swallowed crushed glass. They had been subjected to the preliminary barrage of truth for the past 20 minutes before their golden boy arrived. David froze in the doorway. His chest heaved as he struggled to process the visual reality of his nightmare. He looked at me, then at Terrence, and finally at the men in dark suits surrounding us. He tried to speak, but his voice failed completely. The arrogant wealth manager who had confidently walked into a bank to steal my grandfather's legacy just an hour ago was now a trembling, pathetic shell. I carefully placed my teacup on the leather coaster. I picked up a thick, meticulously organized folder from the cushion beside me and tossed it onto the center glass coffee table. The heavy thud made Diane flinch visibly. I told David to come closer and look at the paperwork. I calmly suggested that he should always review the fine print before signing binding legal contracts. David took a hesitant, shaking step forward. He looked down through the glass table. Spread across the reflective surface were three distinct documents. The first was a freshly drafted petition for absolute divorce citing extreme financial abuse, adultery, and domestic fraud. The second was the printed confirmation of the federal tax seizure, validating that the $2.5 million had permanently cleared the massive corporate penalty he and Thomas created. The third was a high-resolution copy of the personal guarantor addendum he had aggressively signed less than an hour ago, legally binding him to the massive banking debt. I kept my voice entirely devoid of emotion. A cold, clinical delivery is far more terrifying than screaming. I looked him dead in the eyes and detailed exactly how I dismantled his entire life in 48 hours. I told him I knew about the $5 million life insurance policy. I told him about his forged signature, the hired identity thief named Sylvia, and the one-way first-class tickets to the Cayman Islands hidden in his golf bag. Diane let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth as if she might be physically sick. Thomas gripped the marble mantel so hard his arms shook to keep himself from collapsing. They had known about the offshore embezzlement regarding Terrence, but the revelation of a premeditated murder plot against their own daughter-in-law broke through their sociopathic arrogance. Even Thomas, a man who built his entire life on stepping over others, realized his son had crossed a line that invited mandatory federal prison time. David fell to his knees. The expensive fabric of his suit gathered dirt from the Persian rug. He looked at me with wild, pleading eyes, claiming there was a terrible misunderstanding. He stammered that Sylvia was blackmailing him, that he was actually trying to protect my assets, and that the life insurance was just a standard wealth management procedure. He was throwing desperate, pathetic lies against an impenetrable fortress of evidence. Terrence leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. He looked down at the man who had tormented him with racist microaggressions for years. Terrence calmly explained the digital backdoor he had used to reroute the offshore wire transfer. He detailed how the federal authorities had officially closed the investigation into his software startup because the primary tax liability had just been paid in full by David's personal banking account. Terrence smiled a cold, victorious smile. He looked David in the eye and thanked him for being so incredibly generous and financially responsible. The realization of absolute defeat finally crashed over David. There was no legal loophole. There was no hidden offshore reserve. He had legally signed a $2.5 million debt to the bank, and he had voluntarily paid the federal government a matching sum to cover a corporate crime he could no longer deny. His parents could not bail him out because their own corporate assets were tied directly to the tax filing Terrence had manipulated. The fortress of wealth and arrogance they had used to oppress us was completely leveled. We owned the room, and the demolition was only half finished. Terrence pushed himself off the leather sofa. He towered over David, who was still kneeling pathetically on the Persian rug. The time for polite explanations was over. Terrence reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a secondary stack of documents bound by a heavy metal clip. He did not hand them to David. He threw them forcefully onto the center glass table right on top of my divorce papers. The heavy thud made everyone in the room flinch again. Terrence turned his hard gaze toward Thomas and Diane. He looked at the two people who had spent the last 2 years treating him like an unwanted charity case, making thinly veiled racist remarks about his urban upbringing and mocking his software company. Terrence told them the documents on the table contained the exact Internet Protocol addresses, timestamps, and authorized digital signatures, proving that Thomas and Diane had personally approved the offshore cryptocurrency transfers. They were not innocent bystanders who let their son make a bad trade. They were the architects of the embezzlement. They had knowingly siphoned millions of dollars from Terrence's startup into unregulated digital wallets to hide their own massive corporate losses. Terrence kept his voice brutally steady. He explained that he had spent the last 8 months reverse engineering their entire financial network. He uncovered how Thomas had secretly leveraged the family estate, taking out a massive shadow mortgage to cover the initial margin calls when the crypto market began to crash. The generational wealth they constantly bragged about was a complete illusion. The colonial mansion we were standing in was essentially owned by aggressive private lenders. Their entire portfolio was nothing but toxic debt wrapped in a shiny designer bow. A sharp gasp echoed from the doorway of the drawing room. Rachel stepped out from the shadows of the corridor. She had just returned from a luxury shopping trip, her arms loaded with expensive boutique bags. She dropped the shopping bags onto the hardwood floor. The sound of expensive cosmetics and designer shoes crashing against the wood broke the suffocating silence. She had heard every single word Terrence said. Rachel walked slowly into the room, her eyes darting from the documents on the table to her father, then to her brother groveling on the floor. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She looked at Thomas and demanded to know if it was true. She asked if her trust fund was gone. Thomas could not even look his daughter in the eye. He stared firmly at the floorboards, unable to formulate a single lie to save himself. His silence was the loudest confession possible. The illusion of the perfect wealthy family shattered into a million jagged pieces right before my eyes. The absolute loyalty they had always demanded from each other evaporated the second their bank accounts hit zero. Rachel did not rush to comfort her mother. She did not kneel down to help her brother. She turned into a cornered, starving animal. Rachel began screaming at the top of her lungs. Her voice bounced off the high vaulted ceilings of the mansion. She lunged toward Thomas, beating her fists against his chest, demanding to know how he could be so stupid. She shrieked that she had just signed a contract for a custom home renovation, relying on the quarterly dividend from the family trust. She screamed that her credit cards were already maxed out because she believed she had millions waiting in reserve. Thomas tried to grab her wrists to calm her down, but she shoved him backward with surprising force. Diane finally snapped out of her paralyzed state and tried to intervene. She reached out for Rachel, begging her to keep her voice down and remember that they were a family. Rachel spun around and slapped her mother's hand away with absolute disgust. She looked at Diane and spat out the most venomous words I had ever heard. Rachel told her mother that there was no family left. There was only debt and federal prison. Rachel pointed a shaking finger at David. She told her brother he was a worthless, pathetic failure who could not even steal money from his wife correctly. She screamed that she was not going to let them drag her down into poverty and ruin. Rachel looked directly at the high-power corporate litigators standing behind me and Terrence. She loudly declared that she would gladly testify against her father, her mother, and her brother. She offered to hand over every password, every hidden accounting ledger, and every piece of dirty family laundry she possessed if it meant securing immunity for herself. David scrambled up from the floor, his face red with a mixture of humiliation and fury. He lunged toward his sister, grabbing her by the shoulders and telling her to shut her mouth before she incriminated them further. Rachel fought back, scratching at his face and kicking his shins. Thomas stepped in, trying to physically pry his children apart. Diane burst into hysterical sobbing, sinking onto the nearest armchair and burying her face in her hands. It was an absolute massacre. The elegant drawing room had turned into a gladiator arena. They were tearing each other apart, desperately trying to find someone else to use as a human shield. They had spent years projecting an image of untouchable upper-class superiority, looking down their noses at people like me and Terrence. They had treated my career as a joke and Terrence's skin color as a punchline. Now they were brawling on a Persian rug, screaming about immunity deals and ruined trust funds. I sat perfectly still on the leather sofa, sipping the last drops of my Earl Grey tea. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of guilt. I felt a profound, cold satisfaction. Terrence sat back down beside me, crossing his arms over his chest. We watched the chaos unfold like we were sitting in the front row of a theater. We did not need to raise our voices or throw a single punch. We had simply held up a mirror to their greed and let their own toxic nature do the heavy lifting. The predators had realized the trap was closed, and instead of attacking us, they had turned their fangs on each other. One of my attorneys leaned down and quietly informed me that local law enforcement had already been notified about the aggressive altercations at the bank. He whispered that the fallout from the IRS payment was about to trigger an automatic audit flag at the federal level. The physical fight in front of us was just the opening act. The real devastation was waiting right outside their front gates. I nodded, acknowledging the attorney. I placed my empty teacup on the table directly next to my divorce papers. The demolition was proceeding exactly according to plan. The teacup clicked against the glass table. At that exact moment, a low mechanical rumble echoed through the long corridor of the mansion. It was not the sound of police sirens. It was the heavy, synchronized hum of high-performance engines. The chaotic screaming match between Rachel Thomas and Diane ground to a sudden halt. The thick crystal chandelier hanging above us seemed to vibrate from the sheer acoustic force. David froze. His eyes darted toward the massive bay windows overlooking the front circular driveway. The last remaining color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a polished corpse. He knew exactly who was waiting outside. Executing a federal bank fraud and hiring a professional identity thief requires massive amounts of untraceable liquid capital. You cannot pay a wanted fugitive like Sylvia with a personal check. You cannot buy fake passports and set up encrypted offshore shell companies using a standard corporate credit card. David needed hard cash to fund his heist. Because all his family assets were tied up in the toxic crypto debt, he had nowhere legitimate to turn, so he went to the underground. He borrowed his seed money from a ruthless syndicate operating out of the commercial shipping ports. He promised them exorbitant interest. He guaranteed repayment by Thursday afternoon, expecting to hand them a massive cut of my stolen $2.5 million. But the Internal Revenue Service took every single cent. The syndicate does not care about federal tax seizures or botched biometric signatures. They only care about their return on investment. And word travels lightning fast in the criminal underworld when a multi-million-dollar wire transfer vanishes into a government portal. The syndicate knew David lost their money before he even walked back into his childhood home. 4 massive matte black utility vehicles tore through the wrought iron gates of the estate. They did not bother using the security intercom. The lead vehicle simply rammed the gate, forcing the heavy metal doors to buckle and swing violently inward. The tires tore through the pristine manicured grass, stopping aggressively right in front of the marble steps. Mud splashed across the perfectly white statues lining the entrance. The doors opened in unison. 8 men stepped out into the freezing rain. They wore dark tactical clothing. They carried themselves with the terrifying silence of professional predators. They were not here to negotiate loan terms or discuss payment plans. They were here to collect. The heavy mahogany front doors of the mansion were kicked open with a deafening crash. The cold wind howled into the grand foyer, whipping the expensive silk curtains into a frenzy. Heavy combat boots stomped across the imported Italian marble floors. The head enforcer walked directly into the drawing room. He was a towering man with cold, dead eyes and a jagged scar running down the side of his neck. He did not look at the expensive artwork on the walls. Hai ignored Diane, who was backing away and whimpering in sheer terror. He did not even glance at Thomas. His gaze locked onto David like a laser targeting system. David scrambled backward on the Persian rug. He held his hands up defensively, stuttering and begging for just 24 more hours. He promised he could liquidate his father's vintage car collection to cover the principal loan. Thomas immediately shouted in protest, trying to protect his precious assets while completely abandoning his son to the wolves. Thomas yelled that he had nothing to do with this debt and told the men to take David away if they needed to. The ultimate display of family loyalty crumbled into absolute cowardice. Rachel hid behind a heavy wingback chair, weeping hysterically as the reality of their destruction finally took physical form. The enforcer did not say a single word. He simply pulled a heavy metal baton from his jacket and tapped it rhythmically against his palm. The sharp slapping sound echoed through the luxurious room. It was the sound of absolute unavoidable consequence. I smoothly stood up from the leather sofa. I buttoned my charcoal blazer and picked up my leather handbag. Terrence stood up right beside me, adjusting his cuffs with perfect composure. Our three corporate attorneys followed suit, gathering their briefcases and stacking the divorce papers neatly on the table. We walked directly toward the grand foyer. We did not run. We did not panic. We walked with the calm, deliberate pace of people who had just won a war. As we approached the doorway, the massive enforcer turned his head to look at us. His cold eyes swept over me, and Terrence assessing the threat level. He saw my sharp suit and the highly paid lawyers flanking us. He recognized immediately that we were not part of David's desperate criminal gamble. We were completely irrelevant to his debt collection. The enforcer took one step back, leaving a clear, wide path for us to exit the drawing room. Hai gave a brief, subtle nod of professional courtesy, acknowledging that we had no business in the coming slaughter. I stepped past the enforcer without breaking my stride. I walked through the grand foyer and out the broken front doors. The crisp, freezing Seattle air hit my face, feeling incredibly pure and cleansing. I stood on the marble steps for a brief second, looking at the fleet of black vehicles blocking the driveway. Inside the mansion, I heard the sharp sound of shattering glass, followed by David screaming for his father to help him. I heard the unmistakable thud of physical retaliation. They had built their entire lives on looking down at people like me and Terrence. They used their wealth as a weapon to abuse, manipulate, and discard anyone they deemed inferior. But they were nothing but cowards, hiding behind a fragile wall of toxic debt. The moment true danger stepped into their house, their arrogance evaporated. They were left to face the very monsters they invited into their lives. Terrence walked down the steps beside me, his head held high. We got into our waiting vehicle. I told our driver to take us back to the city center. I did not look out the window as we drove away from the estate. The demolition was no longer my concern. I had delivered the architects of my suffering directly into the jaws of consequence. Now I had an empire to rebuild. Exactly 30 days after I walked out of that shattered mansion, I stepped into the sterile, highly polished halls of the King County Civil Courthouse. The air conditioning was freezing, but my blood ran hot with pure, absolute focus. The syndicate had extracted their immediate physical toll on my husband, but today was about extracting his legal and financial soul. I wore a tailored crimson suit. I wanted to look like the executioner I was about to become. My lead attorney Harrison walked beside me, holding a single thick leather binder. We pushed through the heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B. David was already sitting at the respondent table. The sight of him was jarring. The arrogant, polished wealth manager was completely gone. He looked 10 years older. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit because his designer wardrobe had likely been pawned or seized. There was a faint yellowing bruise along his jawline, and a rigid stiffness to his posture, indicating ribs that were still healing from his encounter with the syndicate enforcers. He refused to meet my eyes, staring blankly at the wooden table. His attorney, a man named Gregory, stood up as the judge entered. Gregory was known for aggressive, sleazy tactics in high-net-worth divorces. He wasted absolutely no time launching into a wildly fabricated narrative. Gregory painted David as a naive financial advisor who had been manipulated and financially ruined by a vindictive, calculating wife. With astonishing audacity, Gregory formally requested permanent spousal support. High demanded that I liquidate my commercial real estate portfolio and hand over exactly 50% of my total assets to compensate David for his sudden loss of income. I sat perfectly still, listening to the sheer delusion echoing across the courtroom. David actually believed he still had a chance to walk away with my money. He thought the legal system would view him as a broken man deserving of pity. He underestimated my preparation. When Gregory finally finished his pathetic monologue, the judge turned her stern gaze toward our table. She asked if we had a response to the respondent demands. Harrison stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked to the center of the floor. He did not raise his voice. He did not offer a dramatic speech. He simply opened the leather binder and told the judge that we were not there to negotiate assets. We were there to prevent a murderer from profiting off his intended victim. Harrison approached the bench and submitted Exhibit A. It was the certified documentation from the private insurance underwriter. Harrison methodically explained that exactly 48 hours before the fraudulent bank transaction, David had illegally activated a $5 million term life insurance policy on my life. He highlighted the forged digital signatures and the routing numbers paying the massive premium from a hidden offshore account. He pointed out that David had listed himself as the sole unconditional beneficiary. The judge flipped through the pages, her expression darkening instantly. She looked down at David with a sharp, penetrating glare. David swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing visibly. His lawyer Gregory looked confused, clearly unaware of this specific detail. David had lied to his own attorney. Harrison did not give them a single second to recover. He submitted Exhibit B. It was the physical high-resolution copies of the 2 one-way first-class tickets to the Cayman Islands. He proved they were purchased the same day the insurance policy was activated. One ticket for David and one for a woman traveling under a stolen identity. Harrison outlined the timeline, proving David intended to secure the commercial real estate loan, collect the insurance payout upon my highly anticipated fatal accident, and flee federal jurisdiction forever. Then Harrison delivered the absolute kill shot. He submitted Exhibit C. It was a 50-page sworn affidavit, heavily redacted by the FBI, but legally admissible for this civil hearing. It was a written confession from Sylvia, the identity thief. Sylvia knew she was a target for both federal agents and David. To secure a lighter plea deal for her other crimes, she had mailed a heavily documented confession to the federal prosecutor outlining the entire Seattle bank heist. In her own words, Sylvia detailed how David hired her, coached her to mimic my signature, and openly discussed his plan to ensure his wife would not be around to notice the missing funds. The silence in the courtroom was absolute and suffocating. The air grew heavy with the undeniable reality of premeditated evil. Gregory slowly sat down, pushing his chair away from David. A defense attorney will fight for assets, but no civil lawyer wants to stand next to a man actively being investigated for conspiracy to commit murder. David was completely abandoned at his own table. David began to hyperventilate. He stood up unsteadily, placing his hands on the table and stammering that the documents were fake. He claimed I had manufactured the entire paper trail to frame him. He pointed a shaking finger at me, screaming that I was the one who ruined his life. The judge slammed her wooden gavel down with the force of a gunshot. The sharp crack echoed like thunder, silencing David instantly. She leaned over the heavy wooden bench, her eyes blazing with absolute disgust. She told David she had presided over family court for 20 years and had never seen a more chilling documented display of sociopathic greed. She stated that his demands for spousal support were not just legally absurd, but morally repulsive. The judge did not hesitate to deliver the final ruling. The gavel dropped again. She stripped David of every single marital right. She denied his request for alimony with prejudice, ensuring he could never ask for a single dime again. She awarded me 100% of all contested assets, protecting my grandfather's commercial real estate portfolio permanently. But she was not finished. The judge looked directly at the financial documents regarding the botched bank loan. She formally ruled that the personal guarantor addendum David had signed inside Brenda office was legally binding. She cemented the $2.5 million debt entirely to David's personal Social Security number. She decreed that I held absolutely zero liability for his fraudulent actions. Finally, she ordered David to pay every single cent of my exorbitant legal fees. David collapsed backward into his wooden chair. His face was buried in his trembling hands. He was officially stripped of his wealth, his marriage, his dignity, and his future. He was a man buried alive under a mountain of insurmountable federal debt. I stood up, smoothed my crimson blazer, and walked out of the courtroom. I did not look back at the wreckage. The civil slaughter was complete, but the criminal justice system was already waiting in the hallway. I pushed open the heavy brass doors of the courthouse and stepped out into the crisp Seattle morning. The sky was an overcast slate gray, but to me it looked absolutely brilliant. Harrison walked beside me, checking his phone. He gave me a brief, sharp nod. The timing was flawless. I walked down the wide concrete steps and stopped near a massive marble pillar. I wanted a front row seat to the grand finale. Less than 2 minutes later, David stumbled out of the courthouse doors. He looked completely disoriented. His cheap suit hung loosely on his bruised frame. His lawyer Gregory had abandoned him inside, refusing to be seen walking out with a client who was radioactive. David squinted against the daylight, taking a slow, hesitant step toward the street. He had no car, no money, and no home to return to. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a dead cell phone. He never even saw the shadows moving in from the perimeter. 3 unmarked black tactical vehicles screeched to a halt directly in front of the courthouse steps, blocking the entire loading zone. The doors flew open before the vehicles even came to a complete stop. 6 men and 2 women wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed on the back swarmed the pavement. They moved with terrifying synchronized precision. David froze. For a split second, his arrogant brain tried to process the scene. He opened his mouth, probably to demand what was going on, or to invoke his father, corporate attorneys. He did not get the chance to speak a single syllable. The lead agent grabbed David by the shoulder and spun him around with brutal force. David stumbled, dropping his useless phone. The agent slammed him face first onto the cold metal hood of the nearest federal vehicle. The sound of metal hitting bone echoed across the plaza. David let out a sharp cry of pain, struggling instinctively against the grip. A second agent grabbed his wrists, yanking them behind his back, and snapping cold, heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The metallic click was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The lead agent leaned in close to David's ear and read him his Miranda rights in a loud, clear voice. The agent did not stop there. He publicly listed the federal charges right there on the courthouse steps for every passing attorney, clerk, and pedestrian to hear. David was being arrested for aggravated wire fraud, federal identity theft, crossing state lines to commit a felony, and conspiracy to commit murder. David was sobbing now. Real pathetic tears streamed down his bruised face. He begged the agents, telling them it was a misunderstanding. He cried out that his wife had set him up and that he had money to post bail. The agents ignored his delusional rambling. They patted him down, seizing his passport and his wallet. They shoved his head down and forced him into the back of the dark SUV. The doors slammed shut, sealing him inside a mobile steel cage. The man who thought he could price out my life and steal my grandfather's legacy was now property of the United States federal government. While David was being hauled away to a federal detention center, an equally devastating tactical strike was happening across the water on Mercer Island. Terrence had coordinated the entire secondary operation. During the past month, Terrence had meticulously packaged every single IP address, every forged tax document, and every offshore routing code Thomas and Diane had used to embezzle his startup funds. Terrence handed the entire digital vault directly to the Cybercrimes Division of the FBI. At the exact moment David was handcuffed, federal tactical teams breached the wrought iron gates of the colonial estate. The gates had already been damaged by the syndicate enforcers, but the federal agents brought them down completely. Heavily armored tactical vans flooded the pristine circular driveway. Thomas was sitting in his mahogany study, desperately feeding shredded financial ledgers into an industrial paper shredder. He was drinking straight from a bottle of bourbon, trying to destroy decades of white-collar crimes before the walls closed in. He did not hear the front doors being breached. Federal agents kicked the study door open, splintering the expensive wood frame. They swarmed the room, pointing tactical rifles directly at his chest. Thomas dropped the bourbon bottle. It shattered across the hardwood floor, mixing expensive alcohol with the shredded remnants of his fake empire. He was shoved against his own mahogany desk and handcuffed. Diane was caught in the master bedroom. She had dragged 3 massive designer suitcases onto her king-sized bed. She was frantically stuffing them with diamond jewelry, vintage watches, and thick stacks of emergency offshore cash. She was planning to abandon her husband and her son to save her own skin. When the female federal agents entered the bedroom, Diane tried to use her social status as a shield. She screamed at them, demanding they leave her property and threatening to call the governor. The agents were completely unfazed by her pathetic upper-class entitlement. They grabbed her wrists, ignoring her shrill shrieks, and slapped the handcuffs on her. They dragged her down the grand staircase in her silk dressing gown. Thomas and Diane were paraded out the front doors of their mansion. The scene outside was a social execution. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles illuminated the entire neighborhood. Every wealthy neighbor, every country club acquaintance, and every high society rival stood on their manicured lawns watching the spectacular downfall. The neighbors recorded the arrests on their smartphones, capturing Diane sobbing hysterically, and Thomas hanging his head in absolute shame. The untouchable family that had looked down on everyone else was being dragged through the mud in broad daylight. Federal agents carried out boxes of hard drives, seized offshore ledgers and hardware wallets containing the last scraps of their cryptocurrency holdings. The government seized the mansion, placing federal forfeiture notices across the broken front doors. I stood on the courthouse steps in downtown Seattle looking at a message Terrence had just sent to my phone. It was a single photograph of the federal forfeiture notice taped to Thomas and Diane's front door. Below the picture, Terrence had typed a simple message confirming the estate was secured and the targets were in custody. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and took a deep breath of the cold city air. In a single morning, the entire fraudulent empire had been completely eradicated. There were no loopholes left to exploit. There were no hidden assets left to drain. The predators who had tried to consume us were now locked in federal holding cells, facing decades behind bars. The board was completely cleared. The slate was wiped clean. It was time to build something new from the ashes. While I walked away from the courthouse to begin reclaiming my life, Terrence was fighting a very different kind of war in family court. The federal raids had completely neutralized Thomas, Diane, and David, but Terrence still had to sever the final toxic legal tie binding him to that family. He had to face Rachel. Rachel arrived at the family courthouse wearing a wrinkled designer dress she had managed to smuggle out of the estate before federal agents padlocked the front doors. She still carried herself with that infuriating, arrogant posture her parents had drilled into her since birth. Even with her entire family locked in federal holding cells, Rachel firmly believed the system would cater to her. She strutted into the courtroom expecting the judge to grant her primary custody of their 2 young boys. She demanded exorbitant child support and alimony, assuming the court would inherently favor a privileged white mother over an African-American software developer. She lived in a profound state of delusion, completely blind to the reality that her privilege had evaporated the second her parents' bank accounts were frozen. Terrence sat at the petitioner table radiating absolute calm. He was no longer the quiet man forced to swallow racist microaggressions at a mahogany dining table to keep the peace. He was a brilliant tech founder who had just helped the Federal Bureau of Investigation dismantle a multi-million-dollar money laundering ring. When Rachel's lawyer stood up to demand a massive financial settlement, Terrence's attorney did not even need to raise his voice. He simply handed the judge the federal forfeiture documents. He explained that Rachel Trust Fund, her investment accounts, and her inheritance were entirely seized under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. There was absolutely no money left to divide. Then came the custody battle. Rachel tried to paint Terrence as an absent father who spent too much time at his urban office. Terrence countered with a mountain of undeniable evidence. He submitted the heavily documented proof that Rachel knew about the embezzlement of his startup funds and actively participated in the financial abuse that nearly ruined their children's future. He presented character witnesses from the boys' school, proving he was the primary caregiver. The ultimate deciding factor was Terrence's newly cleared financial status. Because David had inadvertently paid off the massive corporate tax penalty using the stolen bank funds, the Internal Revenue Service had officially lifted the tax lien on Terrence's business. Furthermore, the federal prosecutor issued a formal letter completely exonerating Terrence from all corporate fraud. He was a free man with a clean record and a highly lucrative business. The judge looked at Rachel with utter disdain. She noted Rachel's complete lack of employment history, her complicity in financial abuse, and her total lack of a stable home environment. The ruling was swift and brutally decisive. Terrence was granted sole legal and physical custody of both boys. Rachel was denied spousal support entirely. She was granted supervised visitation only on the strict condition that she pass regular psychological evaluations and secure legitimate employment. Rachel completely broke down in the courtroom, screaming that it was unfair. For the first time in her life, crying and throwing a tantrum did not yield a single result. The bailiff ordered her to step back, and she was escorted out of the building with nothing but her empty designer handbag. The reality of poverty hit Rachel like a freight train. With her credit cards declined and her elite social circle completely shunning her to avoid federal scrutiny, she had nowhere to go. She was forced to rent a dingy room in a cheap motel near the noisy interstate highway. The woman who used to complain about the vintage of her imported champagne was now eating microwaved meals on a stained mattress, listening to semi-trucks roar past her thin window. To pay her weekly motel rate, Rachel had to swallow her immense pride and apply for the only jobs willing to hire someone with zero work experience. She was hired as a cashier at a massive discount retail store in a rundown strip mall. She spent 8 hours a day standing on the hard concrete floor, scanning barcodes and bagging cheap merchandise under harsh fluorescent lights. The physical toll on her previously pampered body was absolute. Her expensive manicures were replaced by cracked nails and calloused skin. She had to wear a scratchy polyester uniform and a plastic name tag. Whenever an entitled rude customer yelled at her over an expired coupon, Rachel had to force a smile and apologize. It was pure, unadulterated poetic justice. On one occasion, a former country club acquaintance walked through her checkout lane. The woman looked right through Rachel, pretending not to recognize the disgraced heiress, bagging her discounted cleaning supplies. While Rachel sank to the bottom of the retail food chain, Terrence experienced a meteoric rise. He completely rebranded his artificial intelligence financial compliance software. The tech industry press caught wind of the spectacular true story behind his company. They reported on how he was framed by his wealthy in-laws and how his proprietary software actually helped federal agents secure the indictments. Terrence became a tech industry legend overnight. Venture capitalists, who had previously pulled their funding, begged for a seat at the table. His Series A investment round was oversubscribed in 48 hours. The valuation of his startup skyrocketed. Terrence used his rapidly expanding platform to make a real difference. He moved his headquarters into a sleek glass building downtown and aggressively hired brilliant minority developers who were frequently overlooked by traditional elite firms. He built an inclusive, thriving corporate culture that stood in direct defiance of the prejudice Thomas and David represented. He also used his newly secured wealth to buy a beautiful modern home in an excellent, diverse neighborhood. He designed a massive home office where he could teach his boys how to write code. He filled the house with art, music, and genuine joy. He surrounded his sons with a strong, supportive community that celebrated their heritage and identity. The toxic shadows of Thomas, Diane, and David were permanently banished from their lives. The boys flourished completely free from the insidious prejudice they had been subjected to at their grandparents' estate. 2 weeks after the custody ruling, Terrence and I met for coffee at a high-end cafe in downtown Seattle. The barista brought over our espresso cups. We sat by the window watching the busy city streets. We did not look like two victims who had barely survived a financial massacre. We looked like two predators who had successfully defended our territory and conquered the food chain. Terrence raised his small ceramic cup, meeting my eyes with a look of profound mutual respect. We clinked our cups together in a silent toast to the absolute destruction of our enemies and the brilliant empires we were building from their ashes. 3 days after my coffee with Terrence, I was sitting in my newly leased corner office in downtown Seattle. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the harbor. My commercial real estate risk analysis firm was rapidly expanding into high-level financial fraud auditing. I was reviewing a lucrative contract with a major corporate banking client when my personal cell phone vibrated on the glass desk. The caller ID displayed an unknown number routing through a local Washington area code. I rarely answered unknown calls, but my instincts told me to pick this one up. I swiped the green icon and brought the phone to my ear. An automated robotic voice filled the line. It stated that I was receiving a collect call from an inmate at the Federal Detention Center in SeaTac. The robotic voice asked if I would accept the charges. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair. I looked out at the brilliant blue sky over the Seattle skyline. I pressed the number 1 on my keypad, accepting the charges. I wanted to hear the sound of absolute defeat. The line clicked, and a sharp metallic echo confirmed the connection. David breathed heavily into the receiver. His voice was completely unrecognizable. It was raw, hoarse, and trembling with a pathetic, fragile desperation. He called my name. He sounded like a terrified child who had just woken up from a nightmare. He did not sound like the arrogant wealth manager who had confidently strutted into a bank to steal my grandfather's legacy. He sounded like a broken animal trapped in a steel cage. I did not say a single word. I let the silence stretch over the line, letting him feel the vast, insurmountable distance between my freedom and his confinement. David broke down. He started sobbing aggressively. The sound was a jarring, messy display of self-pity. He begged me not to hang up. He pleaded with me to listen to his side of the story. He launched into a chaotic, desperate monologue trying to rewrite the narrative of his entire criminal enterprise. David claimed he was the victim of his own family. He blamed Thomas and Diane for everything. He told me his father had leveraged the entire family estate to cover the cryptocurrency losses and threatened to destroy David professionally if he did not help them recover the funds. He claimed his parents emotionally manipulated him into orchestrating the bank fraud. He swore he never wanted to hurt me. He sobbed that he was just a desperate son trying to save his family from the syndicate enforcers. He actually tried to frame the identity theft and the $2.5 million heist as a misguided act of familial duty. Then he brought up Sylvia. He claimed the imposter was entirely his father's idea. He swore he felt absolutely sick to his stomach when he sat next to her in Brenda's office. He tried to convince me that he was planning to cancel the wire transfer at the very last second. He spun a pathetic delusional fairy tale where he was the tragic hero who simply got caught in a bad situation. The manipulation was staggering. Even sitting in a federal holding cell facing decades in prison, David was still trying to run a con. He was still trying to manage my perception of him. He finally reached the true purpose of his phone call. His voice dropped to a desperate, pathetic whisper. He begged me to post his bail. He told me the federal judge had set his bond at a massive figure because he was considered a severe flight risk. He knew his parents' assets were completely frozen under the federal forfeiture laws. He knew his sister Rachel was bagging groceries in a discount retail store. I was the only person left on the entire planet who had the liquid capital to secure his release. He pleaded with me to use my commercial real estate equity to bail him out. He promised that if I just got him out of that concrete cell, he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me. He swore he still loved me. I listened to his hyperventilating sobs. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no residual affection. There was no pity. There was only a profound clinical disgust. I analyzed his words the way I analyzed a fraudulent commercial lease. I looked for the liabilities, the hidden clauses, and the blatant lies. When he finally ran out of breath, I spoke. I kept my voice perfectly flat and chillingly calm. The acoustic contrast between his chaotic weeping and my absolute composure was striking. I told him his performance was insulting to my intelligence. I systematically dismantled his pathetic victim narrative in 3 simple sentences. I asked him if Thomas forced him to search for my exact body double. I asked him if Diane held a gun to his head and forced him to buy 2 first-class one-way tickets to the Cayman Islands. Then I delivered the final crushing blow to his delusion. I asked him if his parents forced a 34-year-old wealth management advisor to take out a $5 million life insurance policy on his wife just 48 hours before a planned financial heist. The line went dead silent. David stopped crying. The realization hit him with physical force. He knew about the divorce hearing. He knew my lawyers had presented the evidence. But hearing me say it out loud stripped away his final layer of psychological defense. He realized I had seen the absolute darkest corner of his soul. I knew he was planning a murder. There was no coming back from that. There was no manipulation tactic on earth that could bridge that gap. David let out a quiet, ragged breath. He whispered my name one last time, a final pathetic attempt to reach the woman who used to love him. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my glass desk. I delivered my final verdict. I told him the man I married died the second he walked into that bank with another woman. Enjoy the concrete, David. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button disconnecting the call. The metallic click echoed in my silent office. I immediately opened my carrier settings and permanently blocked the incoming number from the SeaTac Federal Detention Center. I severed the tie completely and irrevocably. I placed my phone face down on the glass desk and looked out at the brilliant Seattle skyline. The air in my office felt incredibly clean. The toxic anchor that had been dragging me down for 6 years was finally cut loose. I was completely free. I severed the tie completely and irrevocably. I placed my phone face down on the glass desk and looked out at the brilliant Seattle skyline. The air in my office felt incredibly clean. The toxic anchor that had been dragging me down for 6 years was finally cut loose. I was completely free. That profound sense of freedom did not make me complacent. It made me hungry. The adrenaline of dismantling my ex-husband and his financial fraud had awakened something dormant inside my brain. I realized that my highly specialized skills in commercial real estate risk analysis were only a fraction of my true potential. The corporate banking system was fundamentally flawed. It relied on outdated security measures and gullible human authorization. David had almost exploited those fatal blind spots to steal my entire life and fund his escape. I refused to let anyone else become a victim of a system I knew exactly how to fix. I walked down the hall of my new corporate suite and opened the door to Terrence and his temporary workspace. He was surrounded by empty coffee cups and multiple monitors with complex lines of code reflecting in his dark eyes. I leaned against the doorframe and pitched an idea that would change the trajectory of both our lives. I told him we needed to stop playing defense. I suggested we take the digital backdoor protocol he used to trap David and scale it into an enterprise-level security software. We could build an artificial intelligence platform that merged his brilliant predictive algorithms with my intricate knowledge of banking compliance, federal escrow holds, and commercial property laws. Terrence stopped typing immediately. He turned his chair to face me, a slow, sharp smile spreading across his face. He recognized the sheer magnitude of the concept instantly. We formed a joint venture that very afternoon. We pooled my newly secured liquid assets and the fresh venture capital he had raised for his exonerated startup. We spent the next 12 months operating in absolute stealth mode. We worked grueling 20-hour days fueled by ambition and the shared trauma of surviving a predatory family. We mapped out every conceivable fraud scenario, including identity theft, offshore shell company routing, forged biometric signatures, and security bypasses. Terrence wrote the code while I designed the legal and compliance architecture. We built an impenetrable digital fortress. Exactly 1 year later, the results of that relentless labor culminated in a single defining moment. I stood backstage at the primary exhibition hall of the Seattle Convention Center. The air vibrated with the low, steady hum of 5,000 attendees taking their seats. We were the keynote speakers at the largest financial technology summit on the West Coast. The guest list included chief executive officers of international banks, federal financial regulators, and the most aggressive venture capitalists in the nation. They were all waiting to see the product that industry insiders had been whispering about for months. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored emerald green power suit. I wore a pair of sharp black stilettos that clicked assertively against the concrete floor. I felt absolutely no fear. The woman who had trembled behind the blinds of a bank manager office was completely gone. I was a forged weapon ready to deploy. Terrence walked up beside me, adjusting the cuffs of his immaculate midnight blue suit. He looked incredibly powerful, radiating the calm authority of a man who had conquered his demons and reclaimed his legacy. He checked his wireless microphone and gave me a firm, confident nod. We did not need to offer each other empty words of encouragement. We had gone to war together and won. Now we were here to claim our spoils. The heavy stage curtains parted, and the booming voice of the announcer echoed through the massive auditorium, introducing our new enterprise. I stepped out from the shadows and walked directly into the blinding glare of the stage lights. Terrence walked right beside me, our steps perfectly synchronized. The sheer size of the audience was staggering. 5,000 faces looked up at us, illuminated by the massive digital projection screens towering behind our heads. I stepped up to the center microphone. I did not start with a polite joke or a standard corporate greeting. I looked out over the sea of banking executives and opened with a chilling, undeniable truth. I told them that right now, at this very second, someone in their institution was authorizing a fraudulent wire transfer. I told them that conventional security measures were failing because modern predators do not hack computer systems anymore. They hack people. They forge signatures. They exploit personal relationships. And they bypass manual compliance checks with terrifying ease. The entire auditorium went dead silent. I commanded the room with absolute precision. I walked across the stage, projecting my voice with lethal clarity. I explained that we had built an artificial intelligence network that eliminated human error entirely. I handed the presentation over to Terrence, who initiated a live demonstration on the massive screens behind us. Terrence executed a simulated attack. He showed the audience a scenario involving a stolen commercial property deed, a forged biometric signature, and a massive offshore wire transfer attempt. It was the exact heist David had attempted to pull off 1 year ago. The audience watched in suspense as the fake transaction bypassed standard banking firewalls. But the moment the transfer hit our proprietary software, the entire screen flashed red. Terrence explained how our algorithm detected the micro-anomalies in the signature velocity and cross-referenced the offshore holding account with federal tax lien databases in less than a fraction of a second. The software autonomously froze the funds, generated a federal alert, and locked the imposter digital footprint into an unchangeable ledger. The demonstration ended with a clean, flawless victory. The transaction was neutralized before a single cent could be stolen. For 2 seconds, the massive hall remained completely silent. Then the front row of banking executives stood up. The applause started like a low rumble and quickly escalated into a deafening roar. 5,000 people rose to their feet, delivering a thunderous standing ovation. The sound washed over me, vibrating through the floorboards and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Flashbulbs erupted from the press pit, capturing the moment our new empire was officially born. I stood at the edge of the stage, looking out at the roaring crowd. I glanced over at Terrence, who was smiling broadly, absorbing the hard-earned validation he had been denied for years. He was no longer the abused scapegoat of a racist, arrogant family. He was an undisputed titan of the technology sector. And I was no longer just a commercial real estate risk analyst. I was the founder and chief executive officer of an impenetrable financial fortress. The terrified wife who had watched her husband plan her murder had died and been reborn as a force of nature. I had taken the worst betrayal imaginable and weaponized it, turning a waking nightmare into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. I stood tall under the blinding lights, owning every single inch of my power, knowing with absolute certainty that no one would ever be able to tear me down again. The thunderous applause in that auditorium eventually faded, but the profound silence that followed when I finally returned to my hotel room that night was the true reward. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city that had once been the backdrop to my absolute lowest moment. I thought about the terrified woman who had cowered in a dark conference room watching her husband steal her future. That woman no longer existed. She had been forged in the fire of betrayal and tempered by the cold reality of survival. Looking back on the wreckage of my former life and the towering height of my new reality, there is a fundamental truth that must be acknowledged and internalized by anyone who has ever been made to feel small. Society works tirelessly to condition women to be the ultimate peacemakers. From a very young age, we are fed a persistent narrative that our highest virtue is our capacity to forgive. We are told to endure hardship with grace. We are instructed to pour our energy, our empathy, and our financial resources into fixing broken men. We are conditioned to believe that if we just love them enough, if we are just supportive enough, their toxic flaws will magically heal. But the harsh, unforgiving reality of human nature is that wolves do not change their inherent nature simply because you offer to feed them. They just wait until you turn your back so they can consume you entirely. When the person sleeping next to you stops viewing you as a partner and starts viewing you as a financial asset to be liquidated, no amount of emotional pleading will change their mind. When a man decides your life is worth exactly a $5 million insurance payout, he has severed the human connection completely. In those moments of earth-shattering realization, tears will not save you. Screaming will not protect your assets. Begging for an explanation will only give your predator the upper hand. Strategy will save you. True power is rarely loud. It is not found in dramatic confrontations, throwing dishes, or screaming matches in the middle of a driveway. True power is about possessing the terrifying discipline to stay dead silent when every instinct in your body is screaming at you to react. It is about swallowing your panic, slowing your heart rate, and observing your enemy with the clinical detachment of a scientist looking at a parasite under a microscope. It is about letting them believe they are the smartest person in the room while you quietly gather your evidence. You secure your accounts, you lock down your digital footprint, and you let their own arrogance blind them to the trap you are meticulously building right beneath their feet. And then when the preparation is absolute, you step aside and let the crushing law of consequences do the heavy lifting. We often trap ourselves in toxic dynamics because we are afraid of the fallout. We fear the judgment of wealthy in-laws who look down on us. We fear the social stigma of a failed marriage. We allow ourselves to be treated as secondary characters, as stepping stones, or as collateral damage in someone else's twisted pursuit of status. We tolerate microaggressions against our allies because confronting the abusers feels too exhausting. But the moment you strip away the fear of their opinions, their power over you vanishes completely. David and his parents believed their generational wealth and social standing made them untouchable gods. They believed they could discard me and exploit a brilliant software entrepreneur without facing a single repercussion. They relied on our silence to maintain their facade. The second we stopped playing by their rigged rules, their entire empire crumbled into dust and federal indictments. Never let anyone convince you that you are just a supporting character in their story. You are not a stepping stone. You are not a collateral asset to be leveraged for someone else's greed. You possess an immense untapped reservoir of intellectual and emotional strength. When you are pushed to the absolute edge, you have a choice. You can let the betrayal define you as a victim, or you can use it as the raw fuel required to become the architect of your own empire. I chose to build a fortress. I chose to turn the darkest day of my life into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise that actively hunts down predators, just like the man I used to call my husband. Now I want to speak directly to you, the person watching this video right now. You might be sitting in your car staring at a text message that proves your entire relationship is a lie. You might be staring at bank statements that do not add up. You might be dealing with a family that constantly diminishes your worth and treats you like a financial safety net. You might feel entirely alone, surrounded by people who claim to love you while actively draining your spirit and your resources. Have you ever uncovered a betrayal that was so deep, so entirely devastating, that it forced you to completely rewrite the trajectory of your entire life? Do not keep that pain locked away in the dark. Do not let the shame of their actions silence your voice. The monsters rely on your isolation to thrive. Share your story in the comment section below. Your experience, your tactical survival, and your ultimate victory might be the exact blueprint someone else desperately needs to read today. Your courage could be the catalyst that gives another woman the strength to quietly pack her bags. freeze her accounts, and walk out the door before the trap closes on her. We build our strength by sharing our survival tactics. Hit that like button to show your support for those who are currently fighting their way out of the darkness. Share this video with anyone in your life who needs a stark, brutal reminder of their own inherent power. And subscribe to the channel for more gripping, unfiltered stories of absolute justice, ultimate resilience, and the incredible triumph of the human spirit. Thank you for walking this journey with me. I will see you in the next video.